Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 180, IO 535e to 536b. I suggested last time that it was part of the techne of the rhapsode to instill in his audience the emotions appropriate to the poetry the rhapsode is declaiming. But Socrates is insisting on depriving Io of any techne. This has been his argument for a very long time now, that the poets don't have a techne, the rhapsodes don't have a techne. It's all down to the gods, who in one way or another inspire the poets and the rhapsodes. And we've had various examples of the way that gods do this. Socrates will now re-emphasize that the rhapsode has nothing to do with the emotions of his audience. Oisthe un hoti houtos estin ho theates ton dactylion ho eschatos, hon ego elegon hupotes Herakleiotidos lithu apelelon ten dynamin lambanen. You know then that this spectator is the last of the rings, which I was saying take the power from each other by the Heracleitan stone. In the original magnet analogy, the magnet not only attracted rings, but gave the rings the magnetic power so that they could also attract other rings. So we're going back to that analogy now. Hode mesos su ho rhapsodos kai hypocrites, hode protos autos ho poietes. Socrates is now providing more detail than he gave in the original magnet analogy. We now learn that the first ring is the poet himself. The second ring, the middle one, is the rhapsode interpreter. And attached to the rhapsode ring is the spectator ring. And these form a chain of 3 rings. In the original magnet analogy, there was no distinction between the rings. It was simply stated that rings were magnetized and therefore attracted other rings. But here it seems we have 3 types of ring. And I suggest that this means that we're talking about 3 types of attraction. The spectator ring is attracted to the rhapsode ring by the performance of the rhapsode. The rhapsode ring is attracted to the poet ring by the words of the poem itself, or the poems themselves, by that particular poet. The poet ring is attracted to one or other magnet, in other words, one or other muse. If the ring itself represents a type of attraction, we don't need to expect a lot of rings. We might expect that a lot of people are represented by each ring. Hode theos dia panton tuton helketen psychen, hopoi anbule tai ton anthropon, anakremanus exalelon ten dynamin. The god, through all these rings, drags the soul wherever he wishes of humans, hanging up the power one from another. It would seem then that each soul of humans is attracted to one ring or another. In other words, there are 3 types of attraction, and the souls of humans are attracted accordingly. Some are attracted directly to the magnet, others are attracted to poets, to what they say. Others are attracted to the performance and spectate. Kai hosper ectes lithu ekenes hormathos pampolus exertetai Choriuton te kai didaskalon kai hupodidaskalon, ek plagiu exerte menon ton tes muses ek cremamenon dactylion. And from that stone there is like a very great chain attached of dancers and teachers and assistant teachers attached sideways to the rings hanging out from the muse. This is where the account becomes a little unclear, to me at least. The poet, rhapsode, and spectator rings represent, so far as I can tell, a chain of attractions, each one being a different sort of attraction, but all containing the divine power of the magnet, the muse. There is no description here of a swarm of poets or rhapsodes or spectators, and we are to assume that they are somehow in the rings or associated with the rings. My problem then is with this account of dancers, teachers, and assistant teachers who are not described as rings, and they seem to be souls somehow attached sideways to the rings. Not only that, they are described as a very great chain, which one would expect from rings, not from souls. Since only 3 types are mentioned, and there are 3 rings, it's tempting to associate each type of soul with one of the rings. Dancers with poets, teachers with rhapsodes, interpreters, and assistant teachers with spectators. Kai homen ton poieton ex ales muses, hode ex ales exertetai. Onomazomen de auto katechetai, tode esti paraplesion. Echetai gar. And one ring of the poets is attached to one muse, while another ring is attached to another muse. And we call this, he is possessed. And this is near enough, for he is held. Being possessed and being held in Greek are the same verb. Being possessed has a prefix, that's the only difference. Of course, poets are actually possessed by God speaking through them, and not simply because they are held or held in place by a magnetic force. I should also point out that when I translated one ring of the poets, the word ring doesn't appear, it is understood, and it would be easy to mistranslate as one of the poets is attached to one muse, while another poet is attached to another muse. However, Socrates immediately carries on by talking about the first rings of the poets. Ecte tuton ton proton dactylion, ton poieton, alloi ex allu au erte menoi esin, cae enthusiazusin, hoimen ex Orpheos, hoide ec Musaiu, hoide polloi ex Homeru catechontai te cae echontai. From these first rings, the poets, others are attached from each one and are enthusing, some from Orpheus, some from Musaios, and the many are possessed and held from Homer. From the formulation here, it looks as though the 3 poets mentioned, Orpheus, Musaius, and Homer, are each one of the first rings of poets. In the previous sentence, we were told that there was one poet ring per muse. If a poet ring represents a type of attraction, we shouldn't expect the ring itself to be a particular poet. For example, Homer is an epic poet, and he is not the only epic poet. Therefore, the poet ring associated with the muse of epic poetry, Calliope, would include Homer but not be named Homer. It seems to me that Socrates is using these three poets to represent various types of poet ring. Homer for epic poetry, and Orpheus and Musaius, two types of lyric poetry. One could be associated with the muse Euterpe, and the other with the muse Terpsichore, or even Polyhymnia. It's not entirely clear to me who would be associated with which muse. To summarize this analogy so far, it looks as though we have 9 magnets to represent the 9 muses. All 9 muses are in the service of Apollo, and he is the one who provides everyone with some divine magnetism. There is no techne anywhere at all unless Apollo himself has it. The first ring attached to the magnet by magnetism is the poet's ring. Now, the poet is not just what we consider to be a poet, but any creator or producer. For example, a historian is also a poietes, and he would be in the ring attached to the muse Clio, the muse of history. Each poet's ring represents a type of attraction to a particular type of divine power, and there will be several representatives within that ring. There are a number of epic poets, a number of historians. The second ring is that of the rhapsode or interpreter, and now we can understand why we need to have an interpreter, because not every muse requires rhapsodes. Historians, for example, attract not rhapsodes, but interpreters or commentators. This is especially true nowadays when very few people can read historians such as Herodotus in the original language and without the aid of a full commentary. The spectator of history, therefore, is attracted to the interpreter ring. We should also remember the problematic dancers, teachers, and assistant teachers who are connected somehow to the rings, but I don't see how they would fit with history, for example, where not a lot of dancing would take place.